Hi everyone, my name is James Ivanatakis and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian American Fulbright Commission. And welcome to this week's episode of In Conversation. So we're turning our mind to, or our eye to, the question of leadership. And the issue of leadership is in the news consistently. It's on our minds. What makes a good leader? What makes a terrible leader? We're constantly analysing leaders, and how do we understand leadership? Not only today's leaders, but actually going back through time. We're reassessing a lot of leaders. We're reassessing their decisions. We're trying to come to a conclusion about the type of person they were and what drove them to the decisions. Now, one of the issues around leadership that we often look at is a question of honour. But we often take a one-dimensional understanding of what honour means. And to actually discuss this issue of honour and leadership, we're lucky enough to be joined by 2014 Fulbright Scholar and a Professor of Politics at Griffith University, Haig, Patapan. Haig, thank you so much for joining us. So just begin by going back to 2014 with your Fulbright Scholarship, which you undertook at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And you're investigating democratic leadership in America. And you're interested in looking at the president as a moral leader. Can you tell us a little bit about that journey and your experience at the time?
Yeah, it was quite an adventure, James, because the first half of my sort of 3-month stay was beautiful weather, very balmy. This was in winter, American winter, of course. And of course, once my family left me, the second half, we had a series of 8 snowstorms that really exceptionally shut down the campus twice and trapped people in Boston and all sorts of things. So it was an adventure in that way as well. But this was the time of the Obama presidency, and so much was hoped for Obama to transform America. So it was an interesting time to be there, and I wanted to explore the notion of moral leadership and the extent to which leaders became not just executives, political executives, but represented causes, represented movements in what they said and how they acted. So I really enjoyed my stay there.
And I mean, the Obama, as you said, this was sort of in 2014. We're sort of at the second part of the Obama administration's journey. So obviously he, after the massive wave of Obama, he comes in 24, he gets re-elected in 2012, and he then becomes, I suppose, caught up in really hyper partisanship. I mean, how much do you think that affected like Obama's move from this sort of position of hope to a position of just being really pragmatic in trying to manage through from this sort of moral leadership to something being a bit more of a pragmatic leader, if that makes sense?
Well, the cliche about you campaign with poetry, and then once you're in office, you have to administer in prose. So that was always going to happen, wasn't it? But I think the trick for the able leaders are to combine those two. And I think he did have those headline speeches on race relations, especially where he felt he could speak towards the end of his presidency. I think he was less sure-footed in the other areas, international relations and economic management and so on, in part because the situation was very difficult for him, I think, in terms of partisanship, as you said. So it's always complicated, but became much more complicated. And he came to realize that he's an amazing public speaker, as you know. There are also limits to that. You can't accomplish everything with speeches. There are other things you need to do. So it's very instructive of how, as explored in my book on democratic leadership, democracies allow you to do great things, but they're always scrutinizing your actions. So it's a two-edged sword.
So you've just published another book, A Dangerous Passion, Leadership and the Question of Honor. Can I ask you, first of all, to tell us a little bit about the book?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky summarizing a book in a few words. I think it's trying to capture the importance of honor for leaders. It's trying to say that honor is, at the same time, one of the most noble passions that encourages leaders to perform works of public sacrifice and contribution. But it also has a darker component where it can inspire some people to pursue glory for their own benefit and sacrificing the public good that way. So it's a kind of Janus-faced or two-edged sword, if I can mix metaphors. And And to understand this, I suggest, is an important aspect of, it's important to understand leadership. And indeed, as I argue in the book, there's a kind of dynamic relationship between leadership and honor that we need to understand better.
And I mean, interesting, if you go back to your time in 2014 there, and you sort of obviously witnessed the transfer from the Obama years into the Trump years. A lot of people, obviously will contrast those two presidencies. I mean, how does your book sort of look at that thread and that sort of, because in a way, honor, we think of honor, and this is sort of, I haven't read the book, but reading around it and what you've been doing is like, and that's what I think is really interesting, is that you're looking at honor as in a more complex way. We often think of honor in a very one-dimensional way. Someone's honorable, but like you said, it has this more subtle and complex understanding about the way that it's pursued by different leaders.
Yeah. So the first thing I tried to do in the book was distinguish between what is honorable, the different ways different communities define honor, whether you shake hands with right hand, left hand, those sorts of things, and the passion of honor, which I argue in the book has a long history in political thought, philosophy, literature, poetry, and so on. And it consists of this desire to be admired for excellence, which can also, as I suggested before, have a pathological counterpart. And in addition to that, I argue in the book that there are two specific faces of honor, which comes to the point you've just made. One is the honorable face of honor, if I can put it that way, which constitutes itself as doing the right thing. And in practice, it means not doing the shameful thing. So when people save someone who's drowning, or run in and save someone in a burning house, and they say, I didn't do that for the reputation, I would have done it anyway, I think they genuinely mean that. I don't think they're doing it for the glory. Perhaps they're doing it because if they didn't, they'd feel ashamed afterwards, that was a cowardly thing not to do that, and so on. I think it's important to distinguish that sort of honor, which ends up preserving what we think are codes of proper behavior, if we can use that language, from this other passion, which also is moved by the desire to be admired, but in the process of that wants to excel, be better than other people in being virtuous. And that manifests itself in a kind of struggle to be the most honorable, to be the most glorious. And in some, it has a pathological aspect where if they can't succeed in being the most successful and glorious in pursuit of excellence, they will do it whatever it takes, even if it means pursuing it in a bad way. So
obviously this is again, if you go back to contrast the two previous administrations, it is an interesting one. And the Trump administration was scrutinized. I think so. I read somewhere in a review that more books have been written by the Trump about the Trump administration than anyone else. I think there was something like 600 books written about the Obama administration, something like 1,500 books written by the Trump administration. Don't quote me on those exact numbers. So it's been incredibly. I mean, again, looking through your lens of. Looking through the lens of honor and passion, and I think there's a really amazing and subtle difference that you've drawn in the idea of how we understand honor. I mean, is in a way, I mean, did the Trump administration alter your view of leadership as you witnessed this unfold in things like not taking ownership of sort of making claims of alternative facts and so on? Did those things begin to shift your understanding of how we can understand the passion of leadership and honor?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating contrast, isn't it? The two presidents and using the lens of honor. By the way, I have to say I didn't use them in the book precisely because there are so many publications about them. And I also think it's wise not to make assessments about presidents until they've been out of office for a little while, just to get a sense of equilibrium and balance in one's assessments. But there was certainly this desire to not be bound up by previous rules, to make your own way. to transform things in the Trump presidency. Now, depending on where you sit on what was accomplished, obviously you'll have different perspectives on this. But he was prepared to overturn, change, and adjust things, just as Plato talks about Alcibiades, the great promise and the, sort of the disappointment of the Athenians. Alcibiades in Plato's Symposium comes in and rearranges the furniture because he has to. That's who he is. He can't be made to sit where others have put him to sit. And he does that because it's in his nature, because he will be the center of attention as well. So there are some people who can't help doing that. MacGregor Burns, in his famous account, distinguishes between transformative and transactional leaders. In the book, I address that, and I say actually what he's trying to talk about is magnanimous leadership. And he has in mind someone like Nixon, and he's disappointed with Nixon in saying Nixon wasn't magnanimous. You know, I'm thinking of the Kennedys as magnanimous and so on. My suggestion is we can use honor to understand these forms of leadership a little bit better than simply using the other templates we've got, which predominantly is that all leaders are power seekers. I think if you start with that template, you kind of miss the nuance and the color and sophistication in being able to distinguish between different forms of leadership.
So if we follow that thread through, just continue that thread a little bit. Again, even if we take that idea of the different types of honor, that the second honor that you talk about, the one that's driven by being the best. I mean, is that also? You think that could also be used as a bit to explain sort of the contemporary rise in populism and populist leaders who, you know, they seek to be the most, I suppose, not just the best, but also have the highest levels of approval and seek approval in everything they do?
Yeah, you know, there's a long history of trying to understand what populists are and who they are and so on. The classical understanding of populists, I think, is that it's a pathology of democracy, and it can only happen in a democracy. And it's typically where leaders try to elevate themselves by appealing to the people's justifiable, but sometimes not justifiable instincts, and exploit those sorts of longings and desires to elevate themselves as the protectors of the people. And there's a long tradition on how to control populists, because the populist becomes the other side of the magnanimous leader. Mm. The populist is someone who elevates himself or herself for herself as opposed to the communal common good. And the specific way that happens in democracies is through populism. It manifests itself very differently, obviously, in other regimes, whether they're monarchies, oligarchies, and elsewhere, where different techniques are used. But in democracy, it's the appeal to the people, emotionally at least, and they can decide who shall be elevated. And I think the pathology is when the populist appeals to the fears of the people to elevate himself or herself.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well, because if we go back to that idea of, you know, like, I mean, one of the things that we witnessed, you know, in the last, say, you know, few decades is a declining levels of trust towards democratic institutions. But one of the things that populists seem to do is take the position that they're more honorable than the current leaders, right? So there's a difference between the current leaders and the populace. And I as a leader, doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if I'm a billionaire or you know, whatever I do. My honor and my ethics are closer to yours as a population than they are towards sort of the contemporary, and hence the need to move the furniture around to confirm that. And I suppose that's one of the things that I think is being misunderstood by so many about, you know, populist leaders such as Trump and others. I think they take a very one-dimensional view of that, and I think your book has a potential to recast that understanding within that context.
Yeah, and one of the great tropes for populists is to say, I'm one of you, or equally powerfully, I'm not a politician.
Mm.
And that plays into contemporary notions of authenticity. So the irony is authenticity need not be good authenticity.
Mm.
We assume authentic means good, but you may be yourself and you may not be a very attractive person. But it's almost as though democracies would rather have authentic bad people.
Then, yeah.
Because they prefer the truthfulness as opposed to polished fake people where they smell a rat, as it were.
So then that takes us into like the contemporary kind of ideas of the role of the media in holding people to account, for their authenticity or lack thereof. I mean, we things like Watergate or the Clinton affair, they really did crush, I suppose, the sort of the understanding. I mean, obviously Nixon's career ended, and Clinton was forever going to be marked by the way he behaved. Whereas, more contemporary leaders in today's world just seem to sort of lack that shame factor of, the idea of, I suppose, the honourable, rather than, just sort of that driven by being the best. I mean, do you think there's been a big cultural shift? I mean, in just the acceptance of us? Is that part to do with the authenticity that you just spoke about? Has it got to do with the fact that that we're just not shocked anymore? Has it got to the fact that we've recast what we believe to be honourable? I mean, how do you interpret this changing expectations?
That's a very important point and very complicated one, which we probably can't do justice to. But let me just suggest, in one of the chapters of the book, I explore what I call the anti-politics of fame and identity politics, because I suggest they both look to an anti-politics, but from different ends of the spectrum. The identity politics tries to recover the more substantial notion of individual dignity that the kind of Hobbesian interest-seeking individual denigrated. But coming back to your question about the media, it seems to me that part of the problem has been that the media has fueled enormously the politics of fame, and fame is reputation without excellence. So you become famous celebrity because you are famous. There is no substance behind the mirrors, as it were. And the way it's fueled itself via social media, influencers, and so on, has made it a great contender of the honor of political office, but also changed the vocabulary, in the spirit of what you said, of how we should evaluate shameful actions or admirable actions. You just have to spend a few minutes on TikTok to see that it's almost anything goes. And if the future generation, young men and women, are spending a lot of time looking at YouTube and TikToks for their sense of what is proper and honorable and so on, that's clearly going to distort the way we're going to judge politicians.
Yeah, I mean, we're probably roughly the same age. So I remember this old thing called the Paddington bear affair, where a former politician didn't declare being given the gift of a Paddington bear, and it ended his political career in many ways. We're going back into, I think it was the 80s or the 90s. That's going back, and it's interesting now to compare that to some of the ways that a number of scandals in the last, say, 5 or 10 years. People have just shrugged off. Politicians have just been able to shrug off all sorts of scandals. We have some at the moment, which people are discussing. Does it meet the technical definition of corruption? But when you start talking about technicalities, you're not really talking about honor or ethics. You're talking about technicalities. And it's been a massive shift in the way that, I suppose, in the way that what we expect from our leaders, and the way that, I suppose, leaders pursue their own sort of ends and their own goals.
So I think the other side of the coin, which I think I think the book tries to make it towards the end, is if we do acknowledge that political leaders, aspiring leaders of whatever kind, enter into office not simply for self-aggrandizement and power, but to do public service, the sort of noble face of honor, then we should honor them to some extent. And I do think the current or contemporary approach, which has been to scrutinize to an unprecedented extent the actions of politicians and to assume that they're always corrupt unless we can prove otherwise, has produced an unhealthy politics in the other extreme as well. There's almost no leeway given for anyone. And the assumption is that anyone who enters into politics is a crook, therefore what? It leaves very little scope for public service in any profound sense, it seems to me. So lots of able and talented people who are thinking of a political career think twice, because their attitude, and it's not an unreasonable one, is why would I want to sacrifice my entire life, be under constant scrutiny with no prospect of honorable recognition at the end or during my tenure? Just seems like an equation that doesn't work for them, and they'd much rather spend their time in corporate world, arts, entertainment, anything but the political.
So, hey, if we can just maybe look forward now and think about that kind of the shame honor dynamic going forward. I mean, what do you think is like the future of leadership? What do you think, if we combine that with the type of media scrutiny we just talked about? I mean, what do you think what do you think the future of leadership will look like?
James, it's very hard to trace future trajectories, but it seems to me that honor has always been with us, though we've pretended to not worry about what is honorable and so on. But it's manifesting itself in very distinct ways. I mentioned before the role of identity politics, which is a kind of reintroduction of what is honorable, using different language, different pronouns, different respect to be given to different communities. So democratic leaders clearly now have to engage with that sort of honorableness and do so in a way that shows respect and recognition, but also allows them to make decisions that may not always accord with those honorable principles. So this creates complexity, it seems to me. In particular, I think the entire approach of who can speak and who cannot is going to be a very serious challenge to leaders, because we mentioned authenticity before, but if only certain people can speak for certain communities, then the concept of a common good becomes questionable. But how to recover respect and dignity for communities and speak of the common good is a delicately poised puzzle, it seems to me, in the current situation. In addition to that, in the end of the book, I talk about innovation and how honor and shame encourage and retard innovation and change, both technologically but also politically. So how these factors will advance and lead to progressive politics and how they will hold things back becomes a very important question for the future.
So, okay, so I've got one more question for you. I'm not going to let you get away that easy while we're speculating about the future. I mean, this is the week that we recorded. This was the week that we saw the horrible events, the tragic events in Afghanistan unfold. The sort of the overtaking of the Taliban. And President Biden has been severely criticized for the way he planned the exit, or lack of planning, so to speak, or the lack of intelligence and so on. But one of the critiques I read was that probably the last three presidents, Obama, Trump, and Biden himself, all probably wanted to get out of, or said they wanted to get out of Afghanistan, but no one wanted to be the one. No one wants to be the one to pull the trigger, right? So because, so to speak, to exit, because he's the one that's losing the war. So, obviously Biden is now being held to account for a failure, which is, 20 years in the making, so to speak. I mean, how do we understand that sort of, I suppose, that idea of honor within the context of not wanting to undo bad decisions, because you end up being left holding the can. I mean, how can we use a lens to understand that?
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult one, because you don't want to end up doing the shameful thing, even though you think what seems shameful may be necessary now, which is, I think, what you were intimating. Everyone passed the buck, as it were, in that case. I think that situation is complicated by the underlying question of what can democratization achieve. Remember, initially it was an anti-terrorist exercise, and it became a state building and democratization. So there's an underlying debate there as to the kind of tension between MERS and the introduction of human rights, and the extent to which we can transform regimes that way. But coming back to your proposal, or to your question, and this is typical of an academic talking not in office. It strikes me that the most capable leaders are the ones who will explain to a democratic public the situation and why they made that decision, and say to them, I made this for all of us, and this is why I did it. If they don't do that, or they're not capable of doing that, and they fall back on standard tropes and positions, or blame someone else, I think they're hostage to fortune. It's only when they, for whatever reasons, and using their rhetorical powers, which I previously said had limitations, I think they need to persuade people and say, you need to trust me at some point, and this will work out. And if you think of people like all the great leaders that we admire, from the Churchills to the Lincolns or whatever, they had the capacity in very difficult situations to make the tough calls and to say, I'm doing this for us, and I need to make this decision, even if it costs me my office or whatever. I think the general public respects that if they're persuaded. And so that's where rhetorical ability, not just spin, but substance, persuasive speech, comes to the fore in democracies.
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see, how we look back on this week in years to come. Like you said, it's difficult to, the horrific imagery. It's difficult to sort of make any assessment without being shaped by that.
Part of Biden's problem was he was happy that Trump called it early on, and he thought this is clean. I can get away with this. Yeah. But didn't realize the visuals would attach themselves to his presidency rather than any previous one. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, it's, like everything else, unfortunately, like a lot of things in the US, or most in the US at the moment, it's become very polarized, or it's subject to partisanship, and you just hope that the people in Afghanistan are the ones, or as bound to be the ones, once again left abandoned and feeling, at the whim of a radical regime. But Haig, thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic to chat to you. I really appreciate it. Congratulations on the book, and I look forward to reading it.
Thank you, James.